Okay, so this is the second lecture in chapter 3 of Human Growth and Development. And in this chapter, we're talking about how babies are made, or the basic genetics of it. I don't think this particular slide that we're looking at, I don't actually think that this is covered in your textbook. But for our purposes, we'll just sort of go over it quite quickly. And you're probably familiar, hopefully you got some of this stuff when you were in high school, about the process of the process of conception. So the ovia, this is a half illustration of the uterus and the fallopian tubes and the ovary. And you'll remember that women have two ovaries. They have one on the right and the left, or at least, you know, they're supposed to have that. That's normal development. About every 28 days, an ova, which you're born with about 2 million, you don't get any more. And then over the course of a woman's lifetime, they will mature, and they will become a follicle. And what a follicle does is, I think I'm saying that right, it will be released from the ovary into the fallopian tubes. And then this is the process of ovulation. It happens about every 28 days, roughly. If a woman is in tune to her body, she can usually, or she should be able to sense when she ovulates. This is assuming that she's not on some sort of contraceptive, either a chemical contraceptive or even an IUD can throw off ovulation. But the sensation is a little bit like a very weak menstrual cramp. It'll be on one side of the lower pelvis, and the following month it should be on the other side, because they're supposed to take turns, even though this is assuming that there's nothing, you know, that all things are going by plan. It will also increase her oh golly, I forget the technical term, but the vaginal discharge will be clear, and it may change in odor. It may be kind of sweet smelling. And this is to lubricate, if you will, make it easier for the sperm to travel up into the uterus. And if a woman pays attention to her cycle, she might also develop an increase in her libido, otherwise known as her sex drive. And it's all sort of evolutionary biology's way of making sure that she conceives, of having a baby, right? So the ovula is released, the egg floats down the umbilical, floats down the fallopian tube. And if there is sperm somewhere along the way, and sperm can live for up to 3 days, actually in the uterus or in the fallopian tubes. And hopefully, if it becomes fertilized, if she lets, and in fact, it's the egg that decides which sperm gets in, if she lets one of the sperm in, hopefully it won't be implanted along the fallopian tubes, because that's what we call that's a tubal pregnancy, and you don't want that. You want the egg to float down this way and to implant in the rich and nutrient-rich lining of the uterus. If that doesn't happen, of course, that will shed, and that will be a period or a menstrual cycle. And I'm trying to find a picture, a good image of the egg, which is like, you know, hundreds of times larger than the sperm. And the egg sort of slowly down the fallopian tubes. And there's some interesting wives' tales that suggest that the male sperm, that would be Y sperm, swims faster and dies sooner. And there's some wives' tales about if you're trying to conceive a girl, how does that work? If the male sperm swims faster and dies sooner, you want to make sure that there's not an egg readily to be fertilized. So you would want to have sex before ovulation, because you want the male sperm to die before the egg is released. So it behooves you to know when your ovulation is. Once the egg and the sperm meet, now you have the equivalent of a single cell, because you'll remember that half of the genetic information comes from, hopefully you remember from high school, half the genetic information comes from the sperm, the other half comes from the egg. So when the two meet, you now have a full cell. You now have a full 46, all the information, 46 chromosomes, and you officially have a zygote. And that will implant, and then it will continue to divide and divide and divide and divide and divide until you have a baby. When there are multiple births, I think that's all I was thinking about telling you there. When there are multiple births, there's a couple different ways that can happen. One way is you can have 2 eggs and 2 sperm. Now that's kind of unusual. I mean, that would be not typical for a woman to release more than 1 egg at a time. that might happen. So one of the reasons that twins run in families is because a woman might naturally release more than one egg at a time, and then her daughters might have that same tendency. In vitro fertilization causes there to be multiple ovia released or follicles to be released. So in that case, there would be more than one egg available for fertility, for fertilization. Those would be fraternal twins, where you have different eggs fertilized by different sperm. An identical twin is when it's one egg and it splits in two. And so they have the same genetic, same chromosomal information, they just happen to split in two. Your book does not mention it, but a previous textbook that I used did describe something called a semi-identical twin. And a semi-identical twin is one egg and two sperm, which is apparently quite rare. Maybe that's why it's not in your textbook, but that would also create, so they would have different dad genes, but the same information from the mother. Be considered semi-identical. Yeah, so hopefully I'll find you a cool picture of how big the egg is. I just think that's really cool stuff. I think the statistic is something like only 1 in 10 fertilized egg, or maybe it's 2 in 10 fertilized eggs actually in plants. So the chances that the egg and the sperm will meet are a lot higher than people actually make the term, but yeah, actually even know that they've conceived, that they become pregnant. All right, so this slide is about chromosomes, and I'm not a geneticist, so I'm not even going to pretend to explain this in any great detail. My daughter loves genetics, and she could explain this around me anyway. So, but for our purposes, I want you to understand what we mean by these terms. When you have multiple DNA molecules and they're all strung together, that's what we call the DNA, or that's what we call a chromosome. When there are a bunch of chromosomes together, we call those genes. In this case, I want to talk about, make sure I got this right, I want to talk about the X and the Y gene. I believe that's right. So, chromosomes, yes, you get half of your chromosomes, which are your strings of DNA, you get half of those from your mom, and you get half of them from your dad. The ones that you get from your mom are, you have an X and there are two. Okay, so, and you need lots of different chromosomes to determine lots of different things. Your hair color, your height, your eye color, you know, all of that stuff is determined in this genetic information. But your sex, your biological sex, if you are male or female, if you have a penis or a vagina, that's determined by one pair, make sure I'm using the words right, yes, by one pair of chromosomes. And those are the X and the Y, right? Girls have two X's. Girls have an X and an X. That is all mom can give to her offspring is an X. That's the only thing she can contribute. Boys have an X and a Y. So it's the sperm that decides if the baby is going to be a boy or a girl, right? So the example I was using just a second ago, if you want to have a boy baby, male sperm swims fast. Effectively, what I'm suggesting is it an X sperm or is it a Y sperm? If a Y sperm gets to the X egg, it's going to become male. If an X sperm gets to the X egg, because that's all she can do is make X eggs. But if his sperm is X or Y, will determine what that child, what that zygote develops into, if it's a boy or a girl. Here's the thing though, is you'll notice in this image that the X's, the X chromosomes are longer than the Y's. The Y's are short, right? So in class, I'll talk about, you know, she's great big and X, she's got all this room to store all of this genetic information on, all of this DNA can be stored on her great big X. He's kind of like standing on one foot. He has less room that he can store information on. Sounds, one way maybe you could think about it is he's like less smart. I don't know, maybe I shouldn't have said that. But anyway, he's got less room for him to store information on. So what that means is that, well, one of the consequences of this phenomenon is that if there is some information on, say, her X, if the X that she donates to reproduction, say has a birth defect on it, or one great example, maybe she's carrying the gene for male pattern baldness, right? Or there's some evidence that says that autism is carried on the X gene. If she has contributed her X gene and it has something wrong with it, his Y can't back that up. In other words, if her X chromosome has a mistake and he donates an X chromosome, well, it's like it neutralizes it. It counts out, or it makes up, that's the word. It makes up for the error on her X chromosome. But if there's an error on her X chromosome and he donates a Y, there's not a backup. There's not something to make up for it. So the result is, what that explains is why so many traits are considered, they are transferred, or they are inherited by their mother as the carrier. So male pattern baldness is an example. Male pattern baldness is in fact on the X chromosome, right? Your mother passes that trait onto you. It's on the X. If your father gives you an X and it doesn't have male pattern baldness, then you don't get male pattern baldness. If, however, so this is why we see mothers passing on their genes for baldness to their boys, because if your dad gives you your X and your mom gave you an X with baldness, well, you're going to be a girl. If your mom gives you an X and it has baldness, and your dad gives you a Y, you're now a boy who's going to be bald. So you can blame your mom. Same thing appears to be true. I want to say, make sure I got it right. Same thing appears to be true with color blindness. Color blindness appears to be on the X. So your mom gives you the X with color blindness, and your dad gives you an X, you're not colorblind. If your mom gives you an X with color blindness and your dad gives you a Y, you're a boy who's colorblind. Now you might be colorblind if your dad gave you an X too, but that's not as common because you have a backup. I hope that makes a little bit of sense. I've gone over my 10 minutes, so I want to sort of stop there. And when we come back, I'll talk about some more terms and give you a couple more examples of what I mean by that.